When you hear that soft money or outside spending on the Republican side is able to close the gap with Democrats on how much their candidates have raised into their campaigns, it's really not the full picture because candidate money goes so much farther.
I'm Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. This episode is all about money and politics. We dig into the different sources of money that flow into the industry, who they go to, how they're used, and what all of this means for political professionals building businesses in the industry. To keep things simple, we're going to just talk about federal election spending today because all 50 states are different. To help us understand all of this, we're joined by Michael Ahrens, a senior vice president at Bullpen Strategy Group. He was, before that, the communications director at the Republican National Committee and has a background in communications and research. Michael has also been involved in fundraising and as a strategic advisor to major donors. So, Michael, before we can really dive into this topic, we need to go through some definitions and vocabulary. Listeners have likely heard some of these terms before on the show, but now I want to spend some time unpacking them. So let's start with hard dollars versus soft dollars. What's the difference? Where do they come from? And what can be done with them?
Sure. So let's take hard dollars. All candidates for federal office are subject to limits that are set by the FEC, which is the Federal Election Commission. These came as a result of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law that went into effect about 20 years ago. Those hard dollar limits change every 2 years to keep up with inflation. So this midterm cycle that we're just wrapping up,
they're getting ready to double.
they should be. Yeah. Those limits were $2,900 per election, which meant if I wanted to give the most amount of money possible directly to a candidate, I could give him or her $2,900 in their primary and then $2,900 in their general. So $5,800 total. And then there are several other limits, but I think the main thing to know is that there are higher limits for traditional PACs, state parties, and national party committees like the RNC and the DNC. Those two can take the most at $365,000 per year per individual.
Got it. So for hard dollars, it has to come from an individual. They've obviously got to be a citizen of the United States or green card holder, I think is the exception there. And it's $2,900 per election. So if you're a donor to Herschel Walker, for example, you get another one because there's a runoff. But you can't touch that money before the general election, right? So you have to use the primary dollars in the primary.
Correct.
And then, so when we talk about soft dollars, how is it different from hard dollars?
So soft money or soft dollars generally don't have limits. Common entities that are soft money vehicles are usually super PACs or 501c4s.
And so those can be from corporations, other nonprofits, individuals giving above the limit. So that's why they're soft dollars, but they can't go to campaigns.
Correct. The campaign cannot control the soft money expenditure.
And so that we sometimes talk about like that, what is that, like a firewall between coordinated and IE, essentially at some of the big committees. And we've had folks on before talking about that. And so you mentioned to this just a moment ago, but within the soft dollar world, there are some options. So you have super PACs, or what are really known as independent expenditure only PACs, i.e., and then the 501c4 nonprofits. How do those differ?
Sure. So if we take the 501c4s first, by law, their primary purpose needs to be what's called social welfare, which is a somewhat ambiguous term, but I guess just to simplify it, C4s can spend on politics, but politics legally cannot be their main focus. Some popular examples of C4s are the NRA on the right, Sierra Club on the left. C4s can take unlimited money, so there's no limits on what an individual can give to them, and their donors are not disclosed. If we look at super PACs, those can be exclusively political. Just like C4s, they can also take unlimited money, but the donors are disclosed, so you can see who's giving to them. Two big ones in recent cycles have been Senate Leadership Fund, which is McConnell-aligned super PAC, and the Senate Majority PAC, which is tied to allies of Chuck Schumer.
And so what are the advantages of hard dollars in a campaign? Why aren't campaigns just going out and getting major donors and asking them to do these super PACs?
So there's two big ones. The first being candidates control the spend for hard dollars. So if I give to a candidate's campaign directly, that's that $5,800 limit. I give that $5,800. The candidate can spend it however he or she wants. If they want to purchase campaign literature to hand out at doors or on yard signs or on TV ads, it's totally that candidate's choice. And if we take the TV ads, for example, they can decide what those TV ads say and what the messaging is. The second big thing is, if we stick with TV ads for a second, the candidates and only the candidates get special protection under federal law that lets them pay the lowest possible price for broadcast ads. There was a good story a few weeks ago, if your listeners haven't seen it, that Shane Goldmacher wrote in the New York Times about this phenomenon of the special broadcast rate that candidates get. And he used the Nevada Senate race as an example. He compared two 30-second ads, one that supported Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto and one that supported Republican Adam Laxalt. The difference was that Cortez Masto's ad was an ad that her own campaign paid for. It cost $21,000 to air that ad. It was during a Raiders football game. Now, an ad that supported Laxalt that ran during that same Raiders game, it was paid for by a Republican super PAC. And because only the candidate-funded ads get that special rate, the pro-Laxalt ad cost $150,000.
Wow. So what the Masto ad was?
$21,000. Shane actually did the math. It was $4,300 more per second to run the pro-Laxalt ad. So not only is Cortez Masto able to decide what her TV ad says, she's airing it for a small fraction of the cost. So when you hear that, soft money or outside spending on the Republican side is able to close the gap with Democrats on how much, their candidates have raised into their campaigns, it's really not the full picture because candidate money goes so much farther and candidates can decide exactly how that money is used.
Yeah, so even if you're matching them dollar for dollar, you're not closing the gap, really, because they're getting to buy so many more TV ads. And so you do kind of allude to something that's strange that we do see from time to time, where it's like a candidate's campaign will put up a silent B-roll reel, right, and make that publicly available with the expectation that some super PAC or C4 is now going to take that footage and use it for ads. So, and that makes for some really awkward videos sometimes, but that's the reason why you're not allowed to coordinate. But I think that is something that a lot of people sat up and took notice of this cycle, because Republicans were at a huge disadvantage on the hard dollar side with their candidates. The Senate candidates on the Democrat side were outraising Senate candidates on the Republican side. And it meant that they were able to run more TV ads and had clear advantages there. You mentioned disclosure about donors. And so campaigns, parties, and PACs have to disclose their spending with the Federal Election Commission. We call it the FEC. And that makes the industry, our political industry, unique in a lot of ways. So in sort of other sectors, you don't have that sort of granular periodic disclosure. When you get to a bigger company, like a publicly traded company, you have some disclosure. But what gets disclosed to the FEC? So you mentioned donors. What else do we get to see in those reports?
So if you're a federal candidate, you have to disclose a number of things. You regularly file reports, like you said, with the FEC. Typically, it's either monthly or quarterly, and it details how you're spending your money. So you have to list out, how much you spend on travel or catering for a fundraiser or a digital or a TV ad buy. Every dollar really needs to be accounted for, both how it's spent and exactly who it's going to. In terms of the money that you're raising, you need to list out the names, the addresses, occupations of each person who donates over $200 to you. That's the cutoff. So if it's a donation that's less than $200, you don't need to list it, or it's often referred to as itemized. Usually, if you're filing quarterly, like a lot of federal candidates, you're then listing everyone that's given $200 or more in the last 3 months. Cash on hand is another really important figure that's included in these reports, and it's how much a candidate has in the bank at the end of the filing period that they're filing for. So if it's quarterly, how much do they have at the end of that 3 months? And so when a candidate files those reports, there's a lot of attention focused on both how much is raised, but also how much cash on hand they have.
It sort of functions as like a cash flow statement in traditional businesses, because it's a snapshot in time. And particularly for our listeners who might be building their own companies, they need to be aware of looking at a candidate's cash on hand, because it's sometimes a metric for how competitive a race is. And so you might have clients who will put off decisions about buying your product or services until after the quarter, or because they know that they need what you've got, but they also are trying to hit this cash on hand metric. Another thing you'll hear on that is the burn rate, which is exactly what it sounds like. Is a campaign spending more than it's raising? Well, it can't do that for very long. And that's another sort of metric that people use as sort of a proxy for the health or status of the campaign, particularly journalists and major donors and party officials. With respect to the spending on different items, I think another thing that's really tricky for people to understand is just the person that you paid the money to, or the vendor that you paid the money to. You don't get detailed views of how they're spending it. So for example, if you pay for a digital advertising campaign to an agency, you're not going to see what the breakdown is, right, between Facebook and Google.
Right.
So that's why these ad disclosure databases are so fascinating. You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Michael Ahrens about the nuts and bolts of money in politics. Michael, another important distinction is between grassroots donors and major donors. Where do people typically draw that line, and what are the different ways that those donors give?
So, oftentimes you see in reporting, a distinction or a line kind of drawn there at the $200 level, just because, as I mentioned, that is the amount that the FEC has set as a sort of disclosure requirement for where you have to list out a donor. I think typically, grassroots donors are considered people who are giving, $20, $50 here and there, either online or through the mail, which is, the mail is a significant source of fundraising that's often overlooked. When we talk about major donors, these are folks that are giving in the thousands and higher, millions, some tens of millions. So, oftentimes candidates or the parties will have major donor focused programs. They'll set, various levels of giving and benefits that come with those. And they vary, but, common ones, can include access to the candidate, access to their top staffers, invitations to fundraisers, donor retreats, that sort of thing.
So if anyone's ever seen like fundraising materials for a nonprofit, the different donor circles or, presidents levels and things like that, that's sort of what those programs look like. Whereas grassroots donors, right, are just, they're getting solicited by phone or email or mail and giving.
Right. And like I said at the very beginning, when we were talking about hard dollar limits, I mean, if you're a billionaire, you're still subject to the $5,800 limit, the $2,900 for the primary, the $2,900 for the general, in terms of giving directly to a candidate. So if you want to help a candidate's campaign beyond that $5,800, you often will host a fundraiser and engage in what's called bundling. That's where you ask all of your friends to also give $5,800. And so often you go to your closest friends and you say, hey, I'm going to host a fundraiser for this candidate. Will you be on the host committee? And then you'll set a goal for them to be part of that host committee. So let's say, just for the sake of math, that you set that at $58,000. So that means you and then 9 of your other friends need to give $5,800. And then when you're on the host committee, your name goes on the invitation for the fundraiser. You can invite some people. And
you get a picture.
You get a picture. Oftentimes you get more time with the candidate, which is part of the allure of being on the host committee.
Yeah. And they'll stack it with sort of, there's like a VIP reception, and there's the dinner and photo line and things like that. So you get different levels. There's a big gap between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to grassroots donors. So the people who are giving $25, $50, primarily online. What is the Republican Party doing to try and close that gap and catch up?
Yeah, I mean, your listeners have probably heard of this gap before. I'm sure that's something that you've discussed. But I mean, Democrats have really had an advantage for a while. They established a fundraising platform called ActBlue back in 2004. It's raised them billions of dollars since. And chances are, if you've donated to a Democrat or a left-leaning organization, you've seen words at the bottom of in the fine print that says ActBlue. And what ActBlue did was it allowed candidates to raise money from those grassroots donors with just the click of a button. So you didn't need to write a check or go to the candidate's website and use their personal donation page. And it also made it easier to donate to multiple candidates or entities at once, so they could join forces to raise money together. Now, Republicans didn't have a version of ActBlue until 2019. That's when WinRed was established, and setting that up was a huge priority of the RNC and its chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel. I mean, I don't want listeners to think that all of a sudden there is no gap. There is definitely still a gap between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to online grassroots fundraising. But the WinRed platform has gone a long way towards narrowing it.
Yeah, at least giving us the functionality and the tools that match Democrats has been really valuable. There's still that big cultural gap, right? Which is the Democrats have been doing this since 2004. It's new to Republicans. Our supporter base are catching up, but it also falls onto the candidates to make sure that they're recruiting supporters just like they would to host these fundraisers. So I think some really interesting developments on the way for WinRed, and I think we're doing good work to close the gap there. But on the technology front, still a lot of cultural investment that needs to be done as well. Michael, for our listeners who are building their own political businesses, how do they need to approach these different types of clients based on how they're structured?
So I think it's really important to research the organization, figure out what you can about their structure, what their objectives are. For example, there's a lot of groups out there focused on electing Republicans, from the RNC to the McConnell Super PAC, Senate Leadership Fund that I mentioned before. It doesn't take a ton of research to see that the RNC is spending primarily on a field program, so door knocking, phone calls, registering voters, getting out the vote, that sort of thing. Whereas Senate Leadership Fund is primarily spending on TV and digital ads. So I think doing your research is the most important thing.
And it tells you a lot about what their mission is and also who their influences are. And it's really valuable. I mean, that's one of the first things that I walk through with founders who are trying to sell into our industry, right? Is they show them the magical world of the FEC and how everything you need to know is right there, but making sure that their pitch is appropriate to their target customer. Well, Michael, I want to say thank you for a great conversation. Appreciate you making the time to join us today. To our listeners, if this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, maybe you learned something new, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. And as an added bonus, you look smarter in the process as well. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to receive email updates, go to businessofpoliticspodcast.com so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.